All right, pressing forward in our New Testament overview series. We've done all the books of the Old Testament, at least the narrative, and then all the minor and major prophets. And then we've been working our way through the New Testament and found our way to the book of Colossians. This church at Colossae was a church that Paul didn't plant and probably had never been to, never met when he wrote this letter, but he had a friend who was working alongside him named Epaphras, and Epaphras apparently has told Paul about the church and the good things going on in the church, and also told him about some of the things they're being pressured towards in the culture at the time. And so Paul writes this letter to deal with those pressures and to encourage this church to press forward in their knowing of Christ. Epaphras is likely one of the elders or the minister at this assembly, this congregation. He's described in chapter 1 as a faithful minister, and is described in chapter 4 as struggling on their behalf for their maturity, so they mature in Christ. So it's someone who knows them well, knows Paul well, and so that's the connection we have here between Paul and the church of Colossae. So this letter, in large part, was written to oppose what's called syncretistic tendencies, which was a big issue in the first century. Now, the definition of syncretism is simply the amalgamation of different religions, cultures, or schools of thought. And so to put that in layman's terms, what was going on in the first century was people were taking Christianity and just kind of mixing it in with the other religions at the time. You probably know that pluralism was the defining religious ideas at the time, multiple gods, lots of different viewpoints, very similar to today, actually, in a lot of ways, where you can say Christianity is a part of the world religion, a part of the journey to God, but you can't say it's the one true thing, and that's a lot of the same issues they were facing in the first century. And so syncretism was a big problem in the early church, and it was a big problem in the church of Colossae. All these little cities in the Roman Empire and even outside of had their own kind of gods and goddesses, and also worshiped the greater Roman and Greek gods and goddesses. And if you didn't worship those gods and goddesses, then things didn't go that well for you. People weren't happy, right? There was this idea that the worship of those gods and goddesses of your city is what kept your city safe, is what kept the rain coming, is what kept your city fed and protected. And so if you weren't worshiping those gods, then people weren't all that happy with you. So it was difficult to be a Christian. This is why we have all these times in the first centuries of Christianity where the Christians are blamed for bad things that happen, right? Famously, Nero blames the Christians for the burning of Rome, and the reason they're blamed is because they weren't worshiping the gods that were supposedly keeping Rome safe. This is why Christians in the first centuries were accused of being atheists very often, which is odd for us to hear as Christians, but it's because they didn't believe in the panoply of Roman gods or even Greek gods that were so tied in with the culture and the community at the time. The Christians didn't believe in those gods, so they were accused of atheism and were blamed for a lot of the pitfalls that befall these cultures. In fact, Tertullian wrote that when anything went wrong in any city, the cries went up, "Christians to the lance! Christians to the lance!" Right? And so there was this syncretism going on because Christians were facing much pressure and much hardship from outside philosophies, not to mention the sort of inside Jewish tendencies, both of which are dealt with here, to sort of just make Christianity part of the panoply and not make it so exclusive as it claims to be, like the one true religion. But Christians were doing that and facing hardship. And so Paul writes this letter in large part to oppose those syncretistic tendencies. Jesus is not one of many, Paul is saying. He is the way, the truth, and the life. This is the one truth, not one of the truths. He is the truth. Again, so central to the ideas of today. The issues today with Christianity are not Christianity itself. It's when Christians start saying Christianity is the one true religion and everything else is false. That's what gets us in trouble. That's what got the early church in trouble. And we have a tendency then to kind of syncretize other religions into Christianity to make it more palatable to the outside world. And Paul writes to the Colossians and writes to us that is simply not an option for the Christian. Christianity is the one true religion, or it is false entirely. It cannot be one of many. And so the outline we're going to use here is the outline made by Brother Wayne, a minister here with me at the Ohio Church of Christ. He says chapter 1 he calls the supremacy of Christ. Chapter 1 is the supremacy of Christ. Paul starts in a very familiar way where he thanks them for their faith and their love. Common to almost all of Paul's letters is he thanks them not primarily for what they're doing, but because he's heard of their faith and because he's heard of their love. Then he goes on to write sort of a prayer for them. Paul has 4 great prayers that are written in his letters. This is one of them, and they're all parallel. They're all very similar in that he always prays for them to know something as opposed to praying for them even to do something at least directly. Verse 9, asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will and all spiritual wisdom and understanding, so as to walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to him, bearing fruit in every good work, and increasing in the knowledge of him. And so their actions or bearing fruit is a response to their knowing more about God. That our prayers very often should be aimed more at our knowledge, knowing God more, which will result in our acting differently. And the same thing for others, that others may know God more, and the fruit or the actions that we want to see will come as a result of that knowledge. And then perhaps the climax of the chapter, maybe even of the book, is Paul, similar to Philippians, has this poem or this hymn that they're likely familiar with that he quotes that is laying down huge foundational doctrines of the church. We've mentioned in the church service we've had the last couple of weeks how important singing is, and that we should be singing things that are deep and meaningful and moving and profound. There's so much wealth of knowledge of God in the scriptures, and we should be singing these things, and they obviously were doing that in the first century, and we can see that in this hymn where Paul writes, he, that is God or Christ, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. That's huge. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. What a massive view of Christ. This is the Christ that you know. This is the Christ who walked the earth. This is that Christ, the image of the invisible God, the creator of all things, who is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And then he goes forward and talks about how Christ then relates to us, what he does for us. Says he is the head of the body, the church, the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. So this Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the preeminent one. In him the fullness of God dwells bodily, and it is him who reconciled all of us to himself and to God. What a Christ. And he goes on the rest of the book really to work out this poem and what it means that Christ is these things, and finishes this section in the end of chapter 1 talking about his sufferings and how his sufferings identify him with Christ, that he is walking alongside with Christ, and because of that he rejoices that he is able to suffer because Christ is worthy of such suffering. The second section is the sufficiency of Christ, using Brother Wayne's outline, the sufficiency of Christ, which is a good way to word it. So this is that ancient worldview we see, where these pressures that are on the Christians in Colossae, like were in all Christians in the first century. One side, which was the philosophy of Greek and Roman mythology, they were being charged to worship these other gods. And the other side, that side we're so familiar with books like Galatians, the Judaizers who were telling them that they needed to be more Jewish, that they needed to be physically circumcised, they needed to be offering the sacrifices, that was what Christianity was truly. And Paul is saying, no, Christ is preeminent above both of these things. Verses 8 through 11, you can see both these ideas in chapter 2, where Paul says, see to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit. That word philosophy is really a direct connection to Greek and Roman thought, Greek and Roman ideas, the sort of inventors of philosophy, many say. And so when he's talking about that philosophy, he's talking about these ideas of other gods. Let no one take you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. And he's starting to tie in here as well this Jewishness. He says, for in him, in Christ, the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily. Right? There are no other divine beings. There are no other deities. In Christ, all of divinity, all of deity, everything that is divine dwells in Christ. No of these Roman or Greek gods. Everything is found in Christ, and you have been filled in him who is the head of all rule and authority. Then particularly Jewishness. In him you also, were circumcised. So all these Jewish people telling you need to be circumcised, you were circumcised with a circumcision made without hands, by the putting off of the body of flesh by the circumcision of Christ. You can see our overview on Galatians to see how central this issue of circumcision was to the Judaizers, and that Paul is still dealing with it here with these Colossians. So we have these two outside pressures of the Greek and Roman philosophy and these other gods that these Christians weren't worshiping, and they were being persecuted because of their lack of worship for them, and blamed for all the bad things that were happening in the culture. And the other side of the Judaizers that were familiar with biblically, telling them they needed to be more profoundly Jewish, and this meritorious salvation, that these are the works you need to do to be right with God. And Paul is saying Christ is above all of those things. He is the fullness of deity. There are no other deities besides God. He is the preeminent one, and it is him and his circumcision that is the circumcision that is the one that counts. Okay? And then thirdly, we have sanctification to be found in Christ. Sanctification to be found in Christ. And so we see this great Pauline order as we have in all his epistles, where we have all of what Christ has done for us, the wealth that God has done for us in Christ, and then because of that, how we are to live. And that's the way Paul finishes. Paul never starts and says, here's how you're to live, and if you live that way, you'll receive the riches of Christ. But the order is, you have received the riches of Christ, therefore live this way. Therefore live as sanctified people. Verse 1 of chapter 3, if then you have been raised with Christ. The resurrection is the preeminent moment, right? And the sufficient moment. And he says, since you have been raised with Christ, since Christ has been raised and since you have been raised with him, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things that are above and not on things of the earth, for you have died and your life is hidden with Christ in God. So, as Paul often does, he says, live as the humans that God has declared you as. Walk as the humans that God has declared you as, has called you to be, and promises he will make you fully and total in the end. Live that way. Live as those sort of new creations, those new people, which means mortification, verse 5, put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you, sexual immorality and idolatry and all the things he lists there. And then after that, verse 12, put on then, or vivification, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts. So you put to death the old man who has died with Christ, and you raise to life the new man who has been risen with Christ, who is compassionate and after the image of Christ. That the life of the Christian is in large part living out what has already been declared of us. Living out what has already been declared of us. We have been declared holy, therefore live holy. We have been declared dead to sin, therefore die to sinful things. We have been declared alive to Christ, therefore live to righteous things. And there's also this beautiful verse here which says there is no Jew or Greek anymore. There is no circumcised or uncircumcised. There's no barbarian or Scythian. There's no slave or free. Christ is all and in all. The preeminence of Christ, the sufficiency of Christ, the supremacy of Christ. Christ is everything. And we don't need to worry about who is what race and who is what whatever, but Christ is all and Christ is in all. He then works out very practically these household codes and says this is the way Roman households work in the first century, and this is how they should work if those Roman households are Christians. Here's how the husband should treat the wife should treat the husband, the children should treat the parents and the children, slaves and masters to slaves. Here's how things should change. Everything should be different because you are a Christian. You should look different. Your home should look different because you are Christians. And then he moves and closes this letter with even more examples, which I love, where he sends this letter with Tychicus to read this to the church of Colossae. And he says, he sends them that to read this letter that you may know how we are, and that he may encourage your hearts. And listen to this. And with him, Onesimus, who he calls our faithful and beloved brother, who is one of you. Most scholars think that when Paul sent this letter of Colossians, he also sent the letter of Philemon. Philemon, who was a member of the church of Colossae. And if you're a Bible student, you know that Onesimus is the slave who ran away from Philemon sinfully, ended up with Paul, and is converted to Christ. And Paul is now sending Onesimus back with Tychicus, with the letters of Philemon and Colossians, saying he has now been converted to Christ. dear Philemon, who had all rights to punish him by every means of the law for running away. And Paul entreats him. This is likely the reason he ran away, so that he may become your brother, not just your slave. And he returns to you now as a brother, not just as a slave, but as a brother. And Paul is saying Onesimus is with him, our faithful and beloved brother, not identified primarily as a slave anymore, but identified primarily as your brother. Now, just like in those household codes, he tells you that you should treat slaves as your brothers because those who are Christians are indeed your brothers in Christ. And here's an example of that Onesimus, who was a slave who did the worst thing and ran away and deserves death. You should now treat him as your brother because that is what he is in the fullest. His identity is not primarily a slave of Philemon, but a brother of everyone that is there that is a Christian. Onesimus, our faithful and beloved brother, who is one of you. This is a beautiful letter about the enoughness of Christ and the supremacy of Christ above all other philosophies, above all works righteousness, that Christ is everything, and that because of that, everything in our lives, our day-to-day lives, must change. The way we treat everyone and see everyone must be different. It all relates back to Christ, and if it doesn't, then we're seeing things poorly. Love you, church. Talk to you soon.